do you think falls into the category of protecting victims, and what falls into the category of cover up? Because obviously there is a very strong interest in making sure the victims are protected.
Yeah, I'd say probably 0 and 100. They've not shown any deference or respect for the victims at all, for the survivors of this nightmare. And it's all about covering up things that, for whatever reason, Donald Trump doesn't want to go public, either about himself, other members of his family, friends, Jeffrey Epstein, or just the social, business, cultural network that he was involved in for at least a decade.
There it is. And here's what you need to understand, because this is the moment where the machinery of power reveals itself in its most grotesque nakedness, where the veneer of democracy cracks wide open, and what oozes out is something so foul and corrupted that even those who've studied the mechanisms of elite immunity for decades find themselves stunned by the sheer audacity of it all. Just days ago, Trump's Department of Justice announced they were violating federal law by refusing to release the full Epstein files on the December 19th deadline set by the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And when Representative Jamie Raskin speaks with that constitutional scholar precision about 0% being about protecting victims and 100% being about covering up what Donald Trump doesn't want the public to know about himself, his family, his friends, and the entire rotting social network he inhabited for years, we're witnessing something that transcends ordinary political scandal. Because this isn't just about one man's potential complicity in a sex trafficking network run by Jeffrey Epstein. This is about the entire architecture of American oligarchy, protecting itself through the capture and weaponization of the very institutions supposedly designed to deliver justice. And before we go one single step further, you need to understand what just happened in real time, because the Department of Justice released thousands of records on Friday, but at least 550 pages were fully redacted in the initial release, with one series of 3 consecutive documents totaling 255 pages entirely covered by black boxes, and a fourth 119-page document labeled Grand Jury NY, also entirely redacted, which means we're not talking about surgical redactions to protect victims' identities as the law allows, but rather wholesale obliteration of evidence. And then here's where it gets absolutely wild, because at least 16 files disappeared from the DOJ website by Saturday, including a photo featuring 2 pictures of Trump, one showing him surrounded by women in bathing suits, and another partially covered photo showing Trump with Melania Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in 2000. Files that were available on Friday, and then mysteriously vanished without explanation or notice to the public. And when House Oversight Democrats ask what else is being covered up, they're articulating the central question of this entire sordid affair, because the disappearance of evidence from a federal website isn't a technical glitch, it's a deliberate act of concealment. Now let's talk about what Raskin is really saying when he declares with prosecutorial certainty that none of this is about protecting victims, because Democratic members of the House Judiciary Committee accused Attorney General Pam Bondi of shielding potentially damaging information, and wrote that the administration has repeatedly claimed Trump is the most transparent president in history, yet the DOJ has consistently hidden materials and information that may be damaging to Trump. And this pattern of concealment matters because Trump himself promised during the 2024 campaign to declassify the Epstein files if elected, positioning himself as the great exposer of elite pedophile networks while simultaneously his Justice Department under his direct control is now making decisions to withhold files, with Raskin stating clearly it's Donald Trump who's making the call here for whatever reason, which represents not just hypocrisy, but something far more sinister, because when you campaign on draining the swamp and exposing the Epstein network, and then upon assuming power you deploy the full apparatus of federal law enforcement to suppress that very information, you're not just lying, you're actively participating in the cover-up you claim to oppose. And here's what makes this moment historically significant, because we're watching in real time as the Epstein Files Transparency Act was reluctantly signed into law by Trump in November. Yet for months, Pam Bondi has denied survivors transparency and accountability and defied the Oversight Committee's subpoena, which means Congress passed a law with overwhelming bipartisan support, specifically designed to force disclosure, and the executive branch under Trump is simply refusing to comply, violating federal law openly and without shame. And this isn't some procedural dispute about timelines or redaction standards. This is the President of the United States deciding that congressional statutes don't apply to him, when those statutes might reveal uncomfortable truths about his relationship with a convicted sex trafficker who ran what prosecutors described as a decades-long billion-dollar international sex trafficking ring. But wait, Because it gets so much worse when you understand the timeline and the systematic nature of the obstruction, because Trump allegedly abruptly killed the ongoing federal investigation into Epstein's co-conspirators when he took office and undertook a massive redaction project to hide evidence of Trump's ties to Epstein, which means this isn't passive concealment through bureaucratic delay, but active intervention to shut down criminal investigations into the broader network of powerful men who either participated in or enabled Epstein's crimes. And when Raskin talks about covering up things about Trump's family, friends, the social business cultural network Trump was involved in for at least a decade, he's describing something that implicates not just individual misconduct, but an entire ecosystem of elite predation that Trump was embedded within, and now as president commands the institutional authority to shield from accountability. Now let's examine what's actually missing from the heavily redacted release, because Democratic Representative Ro Khanna, who co-authored the Epstein Files Transparency Act, said there's a draft indictment of the first Jeffrey Epstein case that really implicates other rich and powerful men who knew about the abuse or participated in it, and there are witness interviews between the FBI and other people accused of being at Jeffrey Epstein's rape island or going to parties where there were 16 and 17-year-old girls being paraded around. And these aren't peripheral documents, these are the central evidentiary materials that would reveal who knew what and when they knew it, who participated, and who looked the other way. And the deliberate suppression of draft indictments means we're not seeing prosecutorial decision-making about who was implicated in sex trafficking conspiracy, which is exactly what survivors and the public have demanded for years. And here's where the philosophical and moral dimensions become absolutely critical, because this case represents the collision between two fundamentally incompatible visions of American democracy, one where laws apply equally regardless of wealth and power, and another where the oligarchic class operates under different rules entirely. And what we're witnessing with the Epstein Files cover-up is the second vision asserting itself with brazen confidence through the machinery of the Justice Department itself. And this connects to a deeper history of elite impunity that stretches back through decades of American jurisprudence, where the wealthy and connected negotiate sweetheart deals while the poor and marginalized face the full punitive force of the carceral state. And Jeffrey Epstein's 2008 non-prosecution agreement, where he served just 13 months with work release privileges for sex trafficking minors, stands as perhaps the single most grotesque example of this two-tiered system. But let's talk about the bipartisan betrayal here, because given the strong bipartisan backing of the bill that compelled the DOJ to publish the files, some Republicans have made clear they also see a partial release as a violation of the law, with Representative Thomas Massie posting a screenshot of the bill with the language of the 30-day deadline highlighted and saying there was no ambiguity with what the law requires to be released, which means even Trump's own party members who helped force this disclosure are now watching as their president defies the very law he signed. And when MAGA Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who usually provide Trump unconditional support, begin questioning why files are being withheld, you understand the political stakes, because Greene posted on X asking what is in the Epstein files, demanding release of all files, saying the whole point was not to protect politically exposed individuals and government officials, because that's exactly what MAGA has always wanted. What drain the swamp actually means, exposing corrupt, rich, powerful elites who commit crimes, not redacting their names and protecting them. And this internal Republican revolt against the cover-up demonstrates that the demand for Epstein transparency has transcended partisan boundaries because it speaks to a populist rage against elite impunity that animates political movements across the spectrum. And we need to sit with the moral obscenity of what's happening to the survivors here, because Marina Lacerda, who alleges Epstein started sexually abusing her when she was 14, told the Associated Press the newly released files are not fully transparent, asking who are we trying to protect? Are we protecting survivors or protecting elite men who need to be put out there as predators, saying she feels like, again, the DOJ and justice system is failing them. And when you understand that survivors of child sexual abuse and sex trafficking are watching the federal government actively conceal evidence about their abusers and the powerful men who enabled that abuse, you begin to grasp the profound violence of institutional betrayal, because every redactions that shields a perpetrator rather than a victim, every disappeared file that contained potentially incriminating photos of Trump, every wholesale suppression of draft indictments and witness statements represents the government choosing the comfort and reputation of elites over justice for the most vulnerable. Now let's connect this to the broader context of Trump's relationship with Epstein, because while Trump has denied being close with the financier, emails released from Epstein's estate include one where Epstein in 2011 called Trump the dog that hasn't barked, saying Trump spent hours at my house with one alleged sex trafficking victim, and another 2019 message where Epstein wrote, of course Trump knew about the girls, as he asked Ghislaine to stop, plus a 2017 email to Larry Summers where Epstein wrote, "I have met some very bad people, none as bad as Trump, not one decent cell in his body," which means we have documentary evidence from Epstein himself, describing Trump's knowledge of the girls, and his presence at locations where trafficking occurred, and the suppression of additional files takes on a profoundly sinister character when you understand that Epstein's own communications suggest Trump was far more enmeshed in this network than he's ever publicly acknowledged. And here's what should terrify every person who believes in democratic accountability, because while the law gives the Justice Department 30 days to publish the files, there is notably no mechanism to enforce the deadline or seek punishment if the deadline is not met or if lawmakers argue some redactions are improper, which reveals a fatal flaw in congressional oversight where legislative mandates can be ignored by executive branch officials without meaningful consequence. And when Raskin and Garcia say they are examining all legal options in the face of this violation of federal law, while Khanna says he's considering steps including impeachment of Bondi contempt proceedings or criminal referrals, promising to work with survivors to demand full release, we're watching the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, searching for any institutional lever that might force compliance. But the reality is that when the executive branch simply refuses to follow the law, the remedies available to Congress are time-consuming, politically fraught, and uncertain, which is precisely why authoritarian-minded leaders feel emboldened to defy legislative mandates. Let's also examine the performative transparency, because the White House in February invited social media influencers to an event where they distributed binders labeled the Epstein files, but the move sparked backlash because the binders did not contain new revelations but rather information that has long been public, such as pages from Epstein's address book, which represents propaganda masquerading as disclosure, the simulacrum of transparency designed to satisfy MAGA supporters who demanded Epstein files while actually revealing nothing. And this kind of information theater is how authoritarian governments function, where they create the appearance of openness while maintaining total control over what's actually disclosed. And the fact that Trump's Justice Department stages publicity stunts with fake revelations while simultaneously defying legal mandates for actual disclosure tells you everything about how they view the public's right to know. And we need to understand the systemic implications here, because what's at stake isn't just Trump's personal exposure, but rather the revelation of what Ro Khanna calls the Epstein class of people who got to do whatever they want and had enormous power and needed to be exposed, which represents a broader crisis of oligarchic impunity where the ultra-wealthy operate in a parallel legal universe, and this connects to fundamental questions about class power in late capitalism, because when billionaires can traffic children with minimal consequences, when they can die under suspicious circumstances in federal custody, when their networks of enablers and co-conspirators can evade accountability through wealth and political connections, we're not describing individual criminal failures, we're describing a system functioning exactly as designed to protect capital and power, at all costs. Now let's talk about what happened when the files actually came out, because amid the outcry the DOJ sought to draw attention to Clinton, with two agency spokespeople posting on social media images they said showed him with Epstein victims, while Clinton's deputy chief of staff said in a statement the White House was attempting to shield themselves from scrutiny by focusing on the former president, which reveals the naked partisan weaponization of the Justice Department, where Trump appointees selectively highlight Clinton photos while simultaneously disappearing Trump photos from the website. And this represents authoritarian information control, where government agencies function as propaganda organs for the ruling party rather than neutral administrators of justice. And when the Justice Department itself becomes a participant in partisan blame-shifting, you understand how completely Trump has corrupted the institutional independence that's supposed to protect law enforcement from political interference. But here's what makes Raskin's analysis so devastating, because when he says with mathematical precision 0% for protecting victims and 100% for covering up Trump, he's not engaging in hyperbole. He's describing what the evidentiary record actually shows, because attorney Gloria Allred, who represents several of Epstein's victims, said she believes some files may have been under-redacted after seeing several survivors' names that should not have been included, saying she saw a number of survivors' names which should never have been published, because the whole point to protect survivors, which means the DOJ's redaction scheme, isn't even effectively protecting victim identities, the one legitimate use of redaction authority under the statute. And if you're going to violate the law by suppressing evidence, and you can't even competently protect victims in the process, then the entire justification collapses, and what you're left with is pure obstruction serving no purpose except to shield powerful men. And we need to connect this to the historical patterns of institutional capture, because what we're witnessing recalls the Church Committee revelations of the 1970s, when Americans discovered their intelligence agencies had been operating as instruments of elite power rather than democratic accountability, conducting illegal surveillance, infiltrating political movements, assassinating foreign leaders, all while concealing their activities from congressional oversight. And just as those revelations demonstrated that the security state had been captured by a narrow ruling class interested in perpetuating their own power, the Epstein files cover-up reveals that the Justice Department under Trump functions not to pursue justice, but to protect the interests of oligarchs who Trump himself is embedded within and beholden to. Let's examine the international dimensions, because Epstein's network wasn't just American elites, but rather powerful figures long associated with Epstein, including Britain's former Prince Andrew, with the records hardly referencing several such figures, renewing questions about who was scrutinized and who was not, which suggests the cover-up protects not just domestic political figures, but rather an international network of wealthy and powerful men, whose exposure would reveal the transnational character of elite predation. And this matters because it demonstrates that oligarchic impunity operates beyond national boundaries through networks of mutual protection, where American, British, and other elites shield each other from accountability, and Trump's decision to suppress evidence implicating this international network serves the interests of global capital rather than American justice. Now here's what should make your blood absolutely boil, because Attorney General Pam Bondi said she was personally reviewing the files, but when the DOJ and FBI issued an unsigned memo in July declaring they'd reviewed the files and concluded in part that they found no evidence that would lead to other people being charged, saying they would not be releasing any further information, a furious backlash ensued, including from some of Trump's closest supporters, which means Bondi stood before the American public and declared case closed, nothing to see here, despite knowing that evidence existed implicating other individuals in sex trafficking conspiracy, and this represents prosecutorial nullification, where the Attorney General simply decides not to pursue powerful criminals regardless of evidence, and when FBI Director Kash Patel had previously said in interviews that it would be under direct control of the FBI Director whether to release Epstein files, alleging in a separate interview the Bureau chose not to do so because of who's on that list. You understand that even Trump's own appointees acknowledged before assuming office that evidence was being suppressed to protect powerful people, and now those same appointees are administering the cover-up they once condemned. And let's talk about the democratic crisis this represents, because when Democrats have used the files and Trump's changing message as one of the few levers of power they have to go after the Republican Party, which controls Congress and the White House, with Trump and other key figures having vowed before returning to office to release Epstein files as proof that a cabal of child predators was being protected by the government and working to undermine Trump. But now some of Trump's base believes he himself is part of the cover-up. You're witnessing the contradictions of right-wing populism, where the leader who promised to fight elite pedophile conspiracies becomes the chief protector of that very conspiracy once he assumes power, and this pattern repeats throughout authoritarian movements where anti-elite rhetoric serves to mobilize mass support, while actual governance serves elite interests, and the cognitive dissonance this creates within Trump's base when they realize their champion is covering up the very crimes he promised to expose represents a potential fracture point in the MAGA coalition. But we also need to examine the profound inadequacy of liberal institutional responses, because while Raskin and Garcia write strongly worded letters and consider legal options, the tens of thousands of pages made public offered little new insight into Epstein's crimes or the prosecutorial decisions that allowed him to avoid serious federal charges for years, and instead of marking the end of a years-long battle for transparency, the document release was merely the beginning of an indefinite wait for a complete picture, which means that even when Congress passes bipartisan legislation with overwhelming support, when that legislation is signed into law, when the deadline arrives, and when the executive branch simply ignores it, the actual mechanisms available to enforce compliance are so weak and time-delayed that the cover-up can continue indefinitely, and this reveals the structural weakness of congressional oversight in an era of executive aggrandizement where presidents recognize they can simply defy legislative mandates and dare Congress to do something about it, knowing that impeachment is politically difficult and criminal referrals to a DOJ controlled by the president are meaningless. And here's what the Epstein case reveals about the fundamental corruption of American oligarchy, because this isn't just about sex trafficking, as horrific as that is. It's about a system where billionaires can commit the most heinous crimes imaginable against children, and not only avoid serious punishment through sweetheart plea deals, but have their entire network of co-conspirators protected by the federal government itself. And when you understand that missing from the files are FBI interviews with survivors and internal Justice Department memos examining charging decisions, records that could have helped explain how investigators viewed the case, and why Epstein was allowed in 2008 to plead guilty to a relatively minor state-level prostitution charge, you recognize that the cover-up extends back through multiple administrations, both Republican and Democratic, that this isn't just Trump protecting himself, but rather the entire political class protecting the oligarchic networks they're all embedded within, because regardless of party affiliation, America's political elite depend on billionaire donors, attend the same social functions, participate in the same networks of wealth and power, and have a shared class interest in ensuring that elite crimes remain unpunished. So when Raskin says it's all about covering up things Trump doesn't want going public about himself, his family, his friends, Epstein, and the social business cultural network Trump was involved in for at least a decade, he's identifying the core truth, which is that Trump's entire life has been spent within oligarchic networks, where wealthy men protect each other's secrets, where NDAs and legal threats, and media manipulation, and now the power of the presidency itself, all serve to ensure that what happens among the elite stays among the elite, and the Epstein files represent the single greatest threat to that system of mutual protection because they would reveal not just individual criminals, but rather the systemic nature of elite predation, the way power and wealth create immunity from consequences, the way institutions meant to deliver justice become instruments of cover-up. And we need to understand what this means for the survivors specifically, because every day that passes without disclosure, without accountability, without the powerful men who participated in or enabled their abuse being publicly named and held responsible, represents an ongoing trauma, an ongoing injustice, an ongoing demonstration that their lives matter less than the reputations of billionaires and presidents. And survivor Maraicha Chartouni, who said she was abused by Epstein when she was 20 years old, asked if everything is redacted, where is the transparency? Which is a question that should haunt every person involved in this cover-up. Because what are we saying as a society when we protect the powerful at the expense of those they victimized, when we deploy the full authority of the federal government, not to pursue justice for child sex trafficking victims, but to ensure their abusers' names remain concealed? This is the moment, my friends, when you have to decide what kind of country you want to live in, because what the Epstein files cover-up demonstrates beyond any doubt is that we have a two-tiered justice system where the poor face draconian punishment for minor offenses, while billionaires can traffic children and die under suspicious circumstances in federal custody and have their entire network of co-conspirators protected by executive authority. And when Jamie Raskin declares with that prosecutorial certainty that none of this is about protecting victims, he's calling out the fundamental lie at the heart of Trump's Justice Department's position, because if this were really about protecting survivors, their names would be redacted while perpetrators were exposed. But instead we have survivors' names accidentally published while perpetrators remain protected behind wholesale blackouts of grand jury testimony and disappeared files and systematic suppression of evidence. And here's what makes this historically significant beyond just the immediate scandal, because future generations will look back at this moment and ask why we allowed this to happen, why when evidence of an elite sex trafficking network came to light, we permitted the President of the United States to simply suppress that evidence in violation of federal law, why Congress passed bipartisan legislation to force disclosure only to watch impotently as the executive branch defied that legislation, why the Justice Department became an instrument of cover-up rather than accountability. And the answer to those questions will reveal uncomfortable truths about American democracy in the early 21st century, about how thoroughly oligarchic capture has hollowed out our institutions, about how the mechanisms of accountability have been systematically weakened to the point of uselessness, about how even the most basic demands for justice can be thwarted when they threaten the interests of the wealthy and powerful. This is why Raskin's words matter so profoundly, because he's not just critiquing a particular redaction decision or complaining about procedural delays. He's identifying the essential nature of what's happening, which is comprehensive institutional betrayal in service of oligarchic protection. And when you connect this to Trump's broader pattern of authoritarian governance, the attacks on press freedom, the demonization of immigrants, the celebration of police violence, the erosion of voting rights, the persecution of political opponents, you recognize that the Epstein files cover-up isn't anomalous. It's emblematic of how Trump's administration functions to protect power and punish the vulnerable, and the fact that even members of his own party are beginning to question the cover-up suggests that this issue might finally be the one that penetrates the propaganda, the one that forces even MAGA supporters to confront the reality that their leader is not draining the swamp, but rather ensuring the swamp's most predatory creatures remain protected. So here's what we do, because despair is not an option, and cynicism is a luxury we cannot afford. We demand that every member of Congress, regardless of party affiliation, publicly state whether they support full disclosure of the Epstein files, without redactions beyond victim identities. We support Raskin, Garcia, and Khanna in pursuing every legal mechanism available, including impeachment of Bondi, inherent contempt, and criminal referrals, even knowing these remedies are difficult because the pursuit itself demonstrates that lawbreaking has consequences. We amplify survivor voices like Marina Lacerda and Marichki Chartouni, who are telling us clearly that the current approach serves elite interests, not victim protection. We connect the Epstein cover-up to broader patterns of oligarchic impunity, demanding systemic reforms that would actually hold billionaires accountable for crimes, rather than allowing them to negotiate sweetheart deals. We recognize that this isn't just about Trump, but about an entire system of elite mutual protection that transcends partisan boundaries, and we commit to dismantling that system through sustained political organizing. Because what Jamie Raskin has done in this clip is name the truth with unflinching precision, cutting through all the obfuscation and procedural excuses to identify the core reality, which is that Donald Trump is using the power of the presidency to cover up evidence about himself, his family, his friends, and the oligarchic network he inhabited, and that cover-up is being administered through the deliberate violation of federal law, through wholesale suppression of evidence, through the literal disappearance of files from government websites, and every single person who cares about justice for trafficking survivors, about equality before the law, about democratic accountability needs to understand that this is the fight of our time, because if we allow this cover-up to succeed, if we permit the president to simply ignore congressional mandates when they threaten elite interests, if we accept a Justice Department that functions as the president's personal protection racket, then we have abandoned any pretense of democracy and embraced oligarchy openly and completely. This is what resistance looks like in this moment. It's Jamie Raskin speaking truth with constitutional precision. It's survivors demanding accountability despite institutional betrayal. It's even MAGA Republicans beginning to question why their leader is protecting the very elites he promised to expose. And it's all of us recognizing that the Epstein files represent a test of whether American democracy retains any capacity whatsoever to hold the powerful accountable, or whether we've completed the transition to oligarchic rule, where billionaires and presidents operate above the law entirely. The answer to that question will define our political future and determine whether justice means anything beyond a word powerful people deploy to punish their enemies while protecting themselves, and that's why this moment matters so intensely, and why Raskin's declaration that this is 100% cover-up, 0% victim protection needs to reverberate through every institution, every newsroom, every congressional office, every organizing space, until the full truth comes out and accountability finally arrives.